Imagine you're standing on the roof of a palace. Not a metaphor, not a thought experiment, but a real place, a real moment. The year is somewhere around 1180 BCE. Below you, the city of Ugarit spreads out toward the Mediterranean coast, its streets still smelling of cedar oil and sea salt, its warehouses stacked with copper ingots and bolts of purple-dyed cloth. Merchants from Egypt, from Cyprus, from the Aegean, from Canaan, they have all walked these streets. Ugarit is, by any measure of its age, a jewel of civilization. A city of scribes and traders, of diplomats and craftsmen. A city that has existed in one form or another for thousands of years, and it is about to vanish from the face of the earth. Not slowly, not through decline. Not through the patient erosion of centuries. In what archaeologists now estimate was a matter of years, possibly even months, Ugarit will be burned, abandoned, and never rebuilt. The palace will be left mid-meal, with tablets still wet in the scribes' hands, letters unsent, grain undelivered. When excavators uncover this city in the 20th century, they will find a clay tablet in a kiln, baked hard by the fire that destroyed everything around it. On it, the king of Ugarit has written a desperate message to the king of Cyprus. Enemy ships, he writes, have been sighted at sea. The city is in danger. He needs help immediately. The help never came. And Ugarit was not alone. What happened between roughly 1200 and 1150 BCE is one of the most dramatic, most debated, and most consequential collapses in all of human history. Within the space of a few decades, the entire interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age, a sophisticated cosmopolitan network of empires, kingdoms and city-states that had taken centuries to build, came apart. The Hittite Empire, which had rivaled Egypt for dominance over the Near East, disappeared almost overnight. The Mycenaean palace civilization of Greece collapsed so completely that the Greeks themselves would later forget they had ever built it, and the art of writing in Greece would be lost for 400 years. Egypt survived, but barely wounded, shrunken, and never again the superpower it had been. Dozens of cities across the eastern Mediterranean were burned, abandoned, or violently destroyed within what, in archaeological terms, is essentially the same moment. This is not a story about one battle, or one king, or one bad decision. This is a story about how an entire world ended, and the terrifying part, the part that keeps historians awake, is that we still do not fully understand why. To understand the collapse, you first need to understand what was being lost. Because the Bronze Age world at its height was not primitive. It was not a collection of isolated tribes stumbling towards civilization. By 1300 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean had developed something genuinely remarkable, a functioning international order. Think about what that means. You had the Egyptian New Kingdom, one of the wealthiest and most powerful states the ancient world had ever seen, ruling from the Nile Delta deep into Nubia and across into Canaan. To the north and east, the Hittite Empire controlled Anatolia, modern Turkey, and large parts of Syria. Between them, smaller but sophisticated kingdoms like Mitanni, Assyria, and Babylon jostled for position and influence. On the coast of the Levant, city-states like Ugarit and Byblos served as the great trading hubs of the age. And across the Aegean Sea, the Mycenaean Greeks, the people whose legends would one day inspire Homer, operated their own palace-based civilization, with great fortified centers at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and elsewhere. What bound all of these together was trade. Not casual, occasional trade, but a deep, systemic, interdependent web of exchange that modern historians have compared, without exaggeration, to a Bronze Age version of globalization. Here is why bronze itself matters to this story, and why the name of this age is not an accident. Bronze, the alloy of copper and tin that gave this civilization its tools, its weapons, its agricultural implements, its art, was not something any single kingdom could produce on its own. Copper came primarily from Cyprus and from mines in Anatolia. Tin, the crucial ingredient that hardened copper into bronze, came from sources even farther away, possibly from Afghanistan, possibly from Anatolia, possibly from sources in Europe. The exact origins of Bronze Age tin are still debated by scholars, which itself tells you something about how far-flung this supply chain was. This meant that every palace, every army, every farmer in the Bronze Age world was, to some degree, dependent on the functioning of a trade network that stretched across thousands of miles. The Hittites needed tin from the east and copper from Cyprus. The Mycenaeans needed both. Egypt had gold in abundance, but needed timber from Lebanon and copper from abroad. Ugarit needed grain from inland Syria and manufactured goods from the Aegean. Everyone needed everyone else. The evidence for this interconnection is not theoretical. In 1982, a shipwreck was discovered off the coast of southern Turkey near a place called Uluburun. Dated to around 1300 BCE, the Uluburun wreck has become one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, because its cargo reads like a manifest of the entire Bronze Age world. 10 tons of copper ingots from Cyprus, 1 ton of tin ingots, ebony from Africa, glass from Egypt, Canaanite pottery, Mycenaean pottery, weapons from multiple cultures, a scarab bearing the name of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti, the personal belongings of a Canaanite merchant. This one ship, on one voyage, was carrying the products of at least 7 or 8 different cultures across the Mediterranean. It is a snapshot of a world that was, by any reasonable definition, globalized. And that world was about to collapse. The story of the Bronze Age collapse cannot be told without introducing the people who appear in the ancient sources as the primary agents of destruction. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples. They appear in Egyptian inscriptions and reliefs beginning in the reign of Pharaoh Meneptah, around 1208 BCE, and reached their most dramatic appearance in the records of Ramesses III, who fought them in a famous series of battles around 1177 BCE. The reliefs at Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramesses III near Luxor, are extraordinary documents. They show in carved stone a great battle on land and sea. Waves of warriors arrive in ships and on ox carts. They carry distinctive weapons and wear distinctive helmets. Their families travel with them, suggesting not a raiding party but a migration, people on the move, with nowhere to go back to. The inscription accompanying the reliefs says, in part, the foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. For over a century, historians treated this inscription more or less at face value. The Sea Peoples were the answer. They were the destroyers. The collapse was their fault. End of story. But the more archaeologists dug, the more complicated the picture became. And today, the scholarly consensus, and it is important to be honest about the fact that this remains an active area of debate, is that the Sea Peoples were probably not the primary cause of the collapse, but rather one element in a much more complex catastrophe. Some scholars now argue that the Sea Peoples were themselves refugees from the collapse, driven from their own homes by forces we have not yet fully identified, and that they were as much victims as they were agents. Who were the Sea Peoples? This is genuinely uncertain, and any confident answer should be treated with skepticism. The Egyptian sources give them names: the Pelazet, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, but matching these names to known peoples or places is difficult and contested. The Pelazet are often identified with the Philistines, who do appear in the archaeological and biblical record in Canaan shortly after this period. Some scholars have suggested connections to the Aegean, to Sicily, to Sardinia, to Anatolia. The honest answer is that the origins of the Sea Peoples remain one of the great unsolved puzzles of ancient history, and anyone who tells you otherwise with complete confidence is overstepping what the evidence allows. What we can say is that Ramesses III fought them and, by his own account, defeated them. Egypt survived, but the effort was enormous, and Egypt after 1177 BCE was a diminished power, never again the empire it had been during the reigns of Thutmose III or Ramesses II. While Egypt was fighting for its life at the Nile Delta, to the north, an empire was dying. The Hittites had been one of the great powers of the ancient world. At their height, in the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, they had controlled most of Anatolia and competed directly with Egypt for dominance over the Levant. The Battle of Kadesh, fought between the Hittites under Muwatalli II and Egypt under Ramesses II around 1274 BCE, was the largest chariot battle in ancient history and ended in a famous peace treaty, the oldest surviving written peace treaty in the world, with copies in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hittite cuneiform. These were not primitive societies. These were sophisticated states with diplomatic archives, legal codes, and long institutional memories. And yet, within a few decades of that treaty, the Hittite Empire was gone. The Hittite capital, Hattusa, in central Anatolia, was burned and abandoned around 1180 BCE. The royal archives, thousands of clay tablets recording centuries of history, diplomacy, and administration, were left behind. The population apparently departed. There is no sign of a last desperate defense, No mass graves of soldiers fallen in battle. The city was simply left, then burned, then silence. What happened? Here is where the story becomes genuinely haunting, because the Hittites themselves left us clues, and those clues point to something even more disturbing than invasion. In the years before the collapse, the Hittite royal archives contain a series of increasingly desperate letters. The king of Ugarit writes to the Hittite viceroy in Syria asking for grain, enormous quantities of grain, because there is famine in the land. The viceroy writes back acknowledging the crisis. Other letters speak of supply shortages, of disruptions to trade, of cities unable to feed themselves. One letter from the Hittite king himself to the king of Ugarit is a remarkable document. It asks, almost pleadingly, for grain to be shipped as quickly as possible because it is a matter of life and death. Famine. This word keeps appearing in the documents of the Late Bronze Age, and it is one of the most important clues we have to what was happening. Beginning in the 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s and 2010s, a new generation of researchers began applying paleoclimatological methods, the study of ancient climate through pollen records, lake sediments, tree rings, and isotope analysis, to the question of the Bronze Age collapse. What they found was striking. The evidence increasingly suggests that the Eastern Mediterranean experienced a prolonged and severe drought beginning around 1200 BCE and lasting for several decades. A 2013 study analyzing pollen records from the Sea of Galilee found evidence of a sharp decline in rainfall and vegetation beginning precisely at the time of the collapse. A 2019 study using stable isotope analysis of stalagmites from a cave in Israel reached similar conclusions. The climate signal, while not identical across all regions, points consistently toward a period of sustained aridity that would have devastated agriculture across the region. This matters enormously because agriculture in the Bronze Age was not a robust, redundant system with multiple fallbacks. The great palace economies of the Late Bronze Age were, in the language of modern systems theory, highly optimized but fragile. The Mycenaean palaces, for example, kept meticulous records. The linear B tablets that survive from Pylos and Knossos are essentially bureaucratic accounting documents, tracking every jar of olive oil, every sheep, every unit of grain, every worker's ration. This level of administrative control was impressive, but it also meant that the system had very little slack. When the harvest failed, not once, but year after year, the palace could not adapt quickly enough. Think of it this way. A palace economy in the Bronze Age was like a very sophisticated machine with many interdependent parts. It required regular inputs of grain to feed workers, of copper and tin to make tools and weapons, of timber for ships and construction, of olive oil for cooking and lamps, of wool for cloth. All of these inputs came through the trade network. If the trade network was disrupted by drought reducing agricultural surpluses, by political instability making the roads unsafe, by famine driving populations to migrate, then every part of the machine began to malfunction simultaneously. This is what scholars now call a systems collapse, and it is one of the most important conceptual frameworks for understanding what happened. The Bronze Age collapse was not a single event with a single cause. It was the failure of an entire system, a cascading breakdown in which each failure made the next failure more likely. Here is how that cascade might have worked. A prolonged drought reduces harvests across the Eastern Mediterranean. Grain surpluses, which normally funded the palace economies and fed the armies and workers, begin to shrink. Kingdoms that had relied on importing grain, the Hittites, for example, who lived in a relatively arid part of Anatolia, begin to face food shortages. They write desperate letters asking for grain. The kingdoms that might have supplied them are themselves struggling. Trade routes become less reliable as political stability erodes. The specialized craftsmen who produced the luxury goods that lubricated the trade network, the purple-dyed cloth, the carved ivory, the fine pottery, lose their markets and their livelihoods. The armies that kept the roads safe and the borders secure are underfed and underpaid. And then, into this already stressed system, come disruptions from the outside. Migrations of desperate peoples. Raiders who find that the great palaces, once formidable, are now undermanned and undersupplied. Internal rebellions by populations that have lost faith in the palace system's ability to protect and feed them. Earthquakes, which the geological record suggests struck several Mycenaean cities during this period. Disease, which is harder to trace in the archaeological record but cannot be ruled out. Each of these factors alone might have been survivable. Together, in combination, They overwhelmed the system's capacity to recover. Let us walk through what this looked like on the ground, city by city, kingdom by kingdom, because the human scale of this collapse is important. It is easy to talk about systems and cascading failures in abstract terms, but behind every burned palace and abandoned city were real people, scribes, farmers, merchants, soldiers, kings, whose world was ending in ways they could not understand or stop. The Mycenaean palace at Pylos, on the southwestern coast of Greece, was destroyed by fire around 1180 BCE. The Linear B tablets found at Pylos, preserved, ironically, by the very fire that destroyed the palace, give us a remarkable window into the final days. In the months before the destruction, the palace administration was clearly preparing for some kind of threat. Tablets record the deployment of rowers to the coast, the redistribution of bronze from religious vessels to make weapons, a desperate measure that tells you just how short of metal the palace was, and the positioning of watchers along the coastline. The palace knew something was coming. It did not know how to stop it. Who or what destroyed Pylos? The tablets do not tell us. There are no bodies in the ruins, which suggests the population may have fled before the final destruction. The fire was intense enough to bake the clay tablets that recorded the palace's last administrative acts. And then, silence. Pylos was never rebuilt. The Mycenaean palace system, which had administered southern Greece for centuries, simply ceased to exist. The same pattern repeated across the Aegean. Mycenae itself, the city of the legendary king Agamemnon, survived the initial wave of destructions, but was abandoned within a generation. Tiryns, Medea, Thebes, all show signs of destruction or abandonment within the same narrow window of time. The great citadels of the Mycenaean world, with their massive cyclopean walls of stone so enormous that later Greeks would believe only giants could have built them, fell silent, and with the palaces went literacy. The Linear B script, used by Mycenaean scribes to administer the palace economies, disappeared completely. It was not replaced by another writing system. Greece entered what historians call the Dark Ages, a period of several centuries during which population levels dropped dramatically. Long-distance trade essentially ceased, monumental architecture stopped being built, and the art of writing was forgotten entirely. When writing returned to Greece around the 8th century BCE, it came in a completely different form, the Phoenician-derived alphabet that eventually became the ancestor of the Greek alphabet we know today. The loss of literacy is one of the most striking consequences of the collapse, and it tells you something important about the nature of Bronze Age civilization. Writing in the Mycenaean world was not a general cultural achievement. It was a specialized administrative tool used by palace scribes to track resources. When the palaces fell, the need for this kind of record-keeping disappeared, and with it the scribal class that maintained the knowledge. This is not a civilization that forgot how to write because people became less intelligent. It is a civilization whose institutional structures, the very structures that made complex literacy necessary and possible, ceased to exist. In Anatolia, the picture was similarly stark. The Hittite Empire did not simply lose a war, it evaporated. The royal capital of Hattusa was abandoned and burned. The provincial centers of the empire, cities like Alalak, Karchemish, fell or were severely disrupted. The Hittite language, one of the oldest recorded Indo-European languages, ceased to be used as a living administrative tongue. A few successor states in southeastern Anatolia, what historians call the Neo-Hittite kingdoms, preserved some elements of Hittite culture for several more centuries, but the empire itself was gone. The coast of the Levant, modern Lebanon, Syria, and Israel, saw some of the most dramatic destructions. Ugarit, as we began, was burned and never rebuilt. Alalak further north was destroyed. Megiddo in Canaan shows a destruction layer from this period. The great trading cities that had connected the inland empires to the sea routes of the Mediterranean were, one by one, extinguished. Egypt, as we noted, survived. But the Egypt that emerged from the crisis was fundamentally different from the Egypt that had entered it. The new kingdom, with its vast empire in Canaan and Nubia, its great building programs, its confident imperial ideology, was finished. The third intermediate period that followed was characterized by political fragmentation, reduced royal authority, and a general contraction of Egyptian power and ambition. Egypt would recover and produce remarkable things in subsequent centuries, but it would never again be the dominant power in the Near East that it had been under Thutmose III or Ramesses II. Now here is where the story takes a turn that is, in some ways, even more interesting than the collapse itself. Because the Bronze Age collapse was not simply an ending. It was also, in a strange and painful way, a beginning. Out of the ruins of the Bronze Age world, something new emerged. And what emerged was, in certain respects, more durable, more flexible, and ultimately more consequential than what it replaced. Consider the question of writing. The Linear B script of the Mycenaeans was a syllabic system, complex, difficult to learn, restricted to a small class of palace scribes. When it disappeared, it was eventually replaced, several centuries later, by the Greek alphabet, a system so simple and flexible that it could be learned by ordinary people, not just trained specialists. The democratization of literacy that the alphabet made possible was one of the great intellectual revolutions of the ancient world. And it was made possible, at least in part, by the collapse of the palace system that had monopolized writing. Consider iron. The Bronze Age was, by definition, an age of bronze, but bronze required that complex, far-flung supply chain of copper and tin. When the trade networks collapsed, bronze became scarce and expensive. The peoples who survived the collapse had to find alternatives, and they turned increasingly to iron, which was harder to smelt but far more widely available. Iron ore could be found almost everywhere, which meant that iron technology, once mastered, was not dependent on long-distance trade in the same way bronze had been. The Iron Age that followed the collapse was, paradoxically, more egalitarian in its material foundations than the Bronze Age had been. Consider the political landscape. The collapse of the great palace empires created a power vacuum that allowed new peoples and new political forms to emerge. The Phoenicians, the seafaring traders of the Levantine coast, descendants in part of the Canaanite city-state culture that had survived the collapse, became the dominant maritime traders of the early Iron Age Mediterranean. They carried their alphabet, their goods, and their culture across the sea, founding colonies from Cyprus to Carthage to Spain. The Phoenician alphabet became the ancestor not just of Greek, but of Hebrew, Aramaic, and ultimately of most of the writing systems in use in the world today. The Israelites, whose origins are complex and debated, but who emerge clearly in the historical record in the early Iron Age, established their kingdoms in Canaan in the aftermath of the collapse, in a landscape where the great Bronze Age powers that had previously dominated the region were gone or weakened. The Assyrians, who had been a significant but not dominant power in the Bronze Age, would eventually rebuild and expand into one of the most formidable empires the ancient world had ever seen. The Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, all of the great civilizations of the classical world grew in the soil that the Bronze Age collapse had, violently and traumatically prepared. This is not to romanticize destruction. The collapse was a catastrophe for the people who lived through it. Population levels in the Aegean dropped by an estimated 70 to 80% during the Dark Ages that followed. Entire ways of life, entire bodies of knowledge, entire artistic and literary traditions were lost. The people of Ugarit, of Pylos, of Hattusa, they did not experience the collapse as a creative destruction that would eventually lead to something better. They experienced it as the end of their world, and for many of them, it was. But history does not respect human timescales. What looks like pure catastrophe from the inside can, viewed across centuries, reveal itself as a transition, brutal, costly, and unplanned, but a transition nonetheless. The question that haunts scholars, and that has taken on a new urgency in recent decades, is whether the Bronze Age collapse was inevitable, or whether it could have been prevented. And this question is not purely academic. The late Bronze Age world was, as we have seen, a highly interconnected, highly optimized system. Its strengths were also its vulnerabilities. The same trade networks that made it prosperous made it fragile. The same palace economies that concentrated resources and enabled monumental achievement also created rigid hierarchies with little capacity for adaptation. The same specialization that produced remarkable luxury goods and sophisticated bureaucracies also meant that when one part of the system failed, the effects rippled outward in ways that were difficult to contain. There is a concept in ecology called a tipping point, a threshold beyond which a system that has been under stress shifts rapidly and irreversibly to a new state. Ecologists study this in lakes, in forests, in coral reefs. A lake that has been gradually accumulating nutrients from agricultural runoff may appear stable for years, and then, when a threshold is crossed, shift suddenly to a turbid, algae-choked state that is very difficult to reverse. The Bronze Age collapse may have been something like this, a system that had been under multiple stresses for years, perhaps decades, and that, when those stresses converged, tipped rapidly into a new state from which it could not recover. The stresses were real, and they were multiple. Climate change, the prolonged drought that the paleoclimatological evidence suggests, was probably the most fundamental. It was not the only cause, but it was likely the trigger that set the cascade in motion. When harvests failed year after year, when the grain surpluses that funded the palace economies shrank, when famine began to drive populations to move, the system's capacity to absorb other shocks was already severely diminished. Into that diminished system came the sea peoples, whoever they were, wherever they came from. The scholarly debate about their origins and their role has shifted considerably in recent decades. The older view, which saw them as the primary cause of the collapse, has given way to a more nuanced picture in which they are one factor among several. But they were a real factor. Their migrations and raids added military stress to a system already under economic and climatic stress. They disrupted trade routes. They overwhelmed cities that were already weakened. And, as some scholars have argued, they may themselves have been refugees from the collapse, people whose own homes had already been destroyed by drought or famine or political disruption, and who were desperately seeking new places to settle. This is one of the most poignant aspects of the whole story. The sea peoples may not have been conquerors in the traditional sense, ambitious warriors seeking plunder and glory. They may have been something more desperate and more human than that. Families, communities, entire peoples who had lost their homes and were searching for somewhere to survive. The ox carts in the Medinet Habu reliefs, carrying women and children, not just warriors, suggest as much. If this interpretation is correct, then the Bronze Age collapse was not a story of civilization versus barbarian, of settled people versus nomadic destroyers. It was a story of desperate people colliding with other desperate people in a world that was already coming apart. There are other factors that scholars have proposed with varying degrees of evidence. Earthquakes. The geological record does show seismic activity in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean during this period, and several Mycenaean cities show destruction patterns consistent with earthquake damage. Disease, always difficult to trace in the archaeological record, but the movement of large populations across the Mediterranean in this period would have created opportunities for epidemic spread. Internal rebellion. Some scholars have argued that the highly stratified palace economies generated social tensions that eventually contributed to their own destruction, with lower classes rising against the palace elites when the system could no longer deliver on its promises of protection and provision. The honest answer is that we do not know the precise weighting of these factors. We probably never will. The Bronze Age collapse is, in some sense, the ultimate cold case, a crime scene 3,000 years old, with fragmentary evidence, competing interpretations, and no surviving witnesses. What we can say with confidence is that it was multi-causal, that it was catastrophic, and that it transformed the world. There is one more dimension to this story that deserves attention, because it speaks directly to why this ancient catastrophe has captured so much scholarly and popular interest in recent decades. We live in a world that is, in certain structural ways, reminiscent of the late Bronze Age. We live in a highly interconnected, highly optimized global system. Our supply chains stretch across the world. Our economies are deeply interdependent. Our agriculture depends on stable climate conditions. We have created systems of extraordinary complexity and productivity, and in doing so, we have also created systems of extraordinary fragility. Now, this is the point at which a responsible historical narrator must be careful. The Bronze Age collapse is not a simple parable for the modern world. The differences between the late Bronze Age and the 21st century are enormous, in scale, in technology, in institutional resilience, in our capacity to understand and respond to systemic threats. Drawing direct analogies is intellectually dangerous and often leads to oversimplification. But the structural questions that the Bronze Age collapse raises are genuinely relevant, not as a prophecy, but as a lesson in systems thinking. How resilient are complex, interdependent systems to multiple simultaneous stresses? What happens when climate disruption, political instability, and economic crisis occur together rather than separately? How much redundancy, how much slack, does a system need to be able to absorb shocks without cascading into collapse? These are questions that the Bronze Age world could not answer in time. They are questions we are still learning to ask. The scholar who has done more than anyone else to bring the Bronze Age collapse to a wide audience is Eric Klein, whose 2014 book, 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed, synthesized decades of archaeological and historical research into a compelling and accessible narrative. Klein's central argument, that the collapse was caused not by any single factor, but by a perfect storm of interconnected stresses, a systems collapse in the truest sense, has become the dominant framework in the field, though it continues to be refined and debated. His work is essential reading for anyone who wants to go deeper into this subject, and it is honest about the limits of what we know. More recently, paleoclimatological research has added significant weight to the climate dimension of the story. The 2022 publication of a high-resolution climate reconstruction for the Eastern Mediterranean, based on analysis of ancient tree rings and lake sediments, provided some of the strongest evidence yet for a severe multi-decadal drought beginning around 1200 BCE. This does not settle the debate. Climate was likely a trigger, not the sole cause, but it has shifted the scholarly consensus toward taking the environmental dimension of the collapse more seriously than earlier generations of historians did. What does the end of the Bronze Age world look like if you try to see it from the inside? Not from the perspective of a modern historian with access to satellite imaging and isotope analysis, but from the perspective of a person living through it? Imagine you are a merchant in Ugarit sometime around 1185 BCE. Your family has been in the trading business for generations. Your grandfather traded with the Mycenaeans. Your father dealt in Cypriot copper and Egyptian linen. You have connections in a dozen ports across the Mediterranean. Your city is wealthy. Your house is comfortable. Your children are learning to read and write in the cuneiform script that has served the commercial world for centuries. But something has been wrong for years now. The harvests in the interior have been poor. Not catastrophically poor, but consistently disappointing, year after year. The grain prices have been rising. Some of the trade partners you relied on have gone quiet. A city in the Aegean that used to send regular shipments of pottery and olive oil has not been heard from in 2 years. There are rumors of trouble in the north, of Hittite cities under pressure, of refugees moving south along the coast. The ships that used to arrive regularly from Cyprus are coming less frequently, and their captains seem nervous, unwilling to talk about what they have seen at sea. The king has been sending urgent messages to allies, asking for grain, asking for military support. The responses have been slow and inadequate. Everyone seems to be struggling. The great network of diplomacy and trade that has sustained your world for as long as anyone can remember seems to be fraying at the edges. And then one evening, a ship arrives in the harbor with news. Enemy ships have been seen. Not the usual pirates who can be fought off or bought off, but a fleet, dozens of ships, carrying warriors and their families. They have already struck somewhere to the north. They are moving south. You do not know, in that moment, that you are living at the end of an age. You do not know that within months your city will be burned and abandoned, that the palace whose scribes have kept the records of your civilization for centuries will be left empty, that the world your grandfather knew and your father knew and you have known will simply cease to exist. You are worried, yes, you are frightened, but you still believe, the way people always believe, that things will somehow work out, that the king will find a solution, that help will come, that the world you know is too large, too established, too real to simply end. It ended anyway. That is the thing about the Bronze Age collapse that stays with you, long after you have absorbed all the scholarly debates about sea peoples and climate change and systems theory. It is not the scale of the destruction that is most haunting. It is the ordinariness of the people who lived through it. The scribe who was baking a tablet in the kiln when the fires came. The palace administrator at Pylos who was still tracking olive oil rations while the watchers on the coast sent back their last reports. The Hittite king who was writing letters asking for grain, not knowing that the empire he was trying to save was already beyond saving. History is full of collapses, of course. Empires rise and fall. Civilizations come and go. We know this intellectually, but the Bronze Age collapse is different in scale and in character from most of the collapses we study. It was not the fall of one empire replaced by another. It was the simultaneous near-total failure of an entire international system, a system that had taken centuries to build and that, in the space of a few decades, simply ceased to function. And out of that silence, that darkness, that centuries-long forgetting, something new was born. The Phoenicians sailed their ships across waters that the Mycenaeans had once dominated, carrying an alphabet that would eventually carry human thought to every corner of the earth. The Greeks, when they emerged from their Dark Ages, built something the Bronze Age world had never quite achieved, a culture of open inquiry, of philosophy, of democratic experiment, of literature written not for palace administrators, but for anyone who could read. The Israelites gave the world a monotheistic tradition that would eventually reshape human civilization on every inhabited continent. None of these people knew they were building on the ruins of a world that had come before them. The Greeks of the classical age had no idea that their ancestors had once built palaces with running water and kept bureaucratic records in a script that had been completely forgotten. They had myths, stories of heroes and monsters, of a great war at Troy, of a world of demigods and impossible deeds, but they did not know that beneath those myths lay the actual memory of a real civilization, a real world that had been lost. When the archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann excavated at Mycenae in 1876 and found gold masks and bronze swords in shaft graves, he telegraphed the Greek king, "I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon." He was almost certainly wrong about the specific identification. The graves he found were centuries older than any historical Trojan war, but he was right about something more important. He had found proof that the legends were not pure invention, that beneath the myths there was history, that the Bronze Age world, which had been forgotten for 3,000 years, had been real. The Bronze Age collapse is, in the end, a story about the fragility of the world we build. It is a story about how civilizations that seem permanent, that seem too large and too sophisticated to fail, can fail anyway. Not because the people in them were stupid or wicked, but because the systems they had built were more fragile than they appeared, and because the stresses that broke those systems were more severe and more simultaneous than anyone had prepared for. It is also a story about survival and transformation. The world did not end in 1177 BCE, even though the world that existed before that date ended. People survived. Communities survived. Knowledge survived, not all of it, not without terrible losses, but enough. And from that survival, from that painful centuries-long process of rebuilding and reimagining, came the world that eventually became ours. The clay tablet from Ugarit, baked hard in the kiln by the fire that destroyed the city, is now in a museum in Damascus. The message on it, the king's desperate call for help against the enemy ships, was never sent. The help never came. The city was destroyed, and the civilization it belonged to passed into darkness. But the tablet survived. The words survived. We can read them today, 3,000 years later, and hear in them something unmistakably human, the voice of a person facing catastrophe, reaching out for help, hoping that someone would answer. That is why we study history, not because the past gives us easy answers, but because it shows us the full range of what human beings have built and lost and built again. The Bronze Age collapse is one of the most dramatic examples in all of human history of how quickly and completely a complex world can unravel. It is also one of the most powerful examples of how, from the ruins of one world, another world can slowly, painfully, remarkably emerge. The next time you encounter a story about interconnected systems under stress, about supply chains and climate and political instability and migration all happening at once, remember Ugarit, remember Pylos, remember the Hittite king writing his desperate letters asking for grain. They were not primitive people. They were not ignorant people. They had built something extraordinary, and they could not save it. But their story survived. And that, in its own quiet way, is a kind of triumph. If this story has made you think differently about how civilizations rise and fall, about the hidden fragility in complex systems, about the way that multiple small stresses can combine into one catastrophic failure, then you are asking exactly the right questions. History is most useful not when it tells us what will happen, but when it shows us what has happened and asks us to sit with the weight of it. If you want to keep exploring these questions, there is so much more to discover. The world that emerged from the Bronze Age collapse, the Phoenicians, the early Israelites, the Greek Dark Ages, and what came after, the rise of the Assyrian Empire, is just as dramatic and just as consequential as the world that was lost. Every one of those stories is waiting. If this video gave you something to think about, consider subscribing so you do not miss what comes next. Leave a comment below. What surprised you most about the Bronze Age collapse? Was it the scale of it, the speed of it, the mystery of it? I read every comment, and the best ones genuinely shape where this channel goes next. And if you know someone who loves history, or who thinks about resilience and complexity, and how the world changes, share this with them. The Bronze Age collapse deserves to be more widely known, and the conversation it starts is one worth having.